David Sheff was born in Boston in 1955 from parents of Russian Jewish descendants. He is author of different books and as a journalist writes for the New York Times as well as for other magazines. His interview subjects have included John Lennon, Steve Jobs and Jack Nicholson. In 2008, his memoir Beautiful Boy quickly reached the #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. It also won the Barnes & Noble Award for the nonfiction, and Amazon selected it as one of the best books of the year. In 2009, David Sheff was included in Time magazine's Time 100, the list of world's most influential people. Lastly, Sheff received media awards from the leading American associations active in the fight against drug addiction. In 2018, Beautiful Boy was adapted into a feature film of the same name, directed by Felix van Groening, having its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival. David and his wife are overjoyed when they have their son, Nick. They live together in California, but 3 years later, their marriage collapses, and Nick, aged 3, is profoundly affected by the change. The divorce leads them to move to different areas of the country, although the situation worsens following joint custody, when at the age of 5, Nick starts to travel alone by plane, spending the school year with his father and visiting his mother for holidays. Shortly afterwards, David remarried, and when Nick is about to start 6th grade, the new family move out of town. Despite David sees his divorce as a possible contributing factor in Nick's later drug addiction, Nick is largely a happy child. When he enters his teen, a new, surly and more withdrawn side of Nick emerges. David tells himself it's typical in early youth. However, one day he finds a bag of marijuana in Nick's backpack. In the same episode, he confesses he drank alcohol and got drunk the year before when he was barely 11. David blames himself for having told Nick about his own history of drug abuse as an adolescent, thinking he might have given Nick tacit permission to use them. Nick reassures his father, asserting that it's an isolated episode, and partially encouraged, David believes him. They live happy and carefree days, until Nick, newly 17 years old, is diagnosed with a stomach ulcer, and David is on the alert again. His drug abuse is escalating into full-blown addiction, and methamphetamine has become his drug of choice. At his parents' insistence, he enters rehab. The next 10 years of his life, indeed, are defined by time in rehab, often relatively long periods of recovery and then relapses. David doesn't want his son to die, therefore he starts doing some research about what addiction really is, and meeting the main professionals in the field of meth abuse, he also understands the extent of brain damage that it causes. In conjunction with Nick's own struggles, David must now confront his own codependency, deciding later to consult a psychologist. So, while his son strives to get clean, he gradually learns to support his recovery instead of trying to take on the responsibility of his son's addiction. After David suffers a brain hemorrhage, he realizes that if he had died, his son's life would have gone on anyway, with or without his protection. The book ends with the author saying he finds himself in a place where he still hopes that Nick stays sober, but he no longer centers his entire life around his son's struggles. David Sheff decides to write a memoir after the great interest aroused by his article My Addicted Son, which appeared in the New York Times Magazine. The article won an award from the American Psychological Association for outstanding contribution to the understanding of addiction. Initially, David Sheff writes in order to try to control the pain he's going through, but it's by attending the Al-Anon meetings he realizes the power of telling a story like this, because though their family story is unique, of course, it is universal too. Sharing it breaks down boundaries, giving permission to people who live or have lived this experience to discuss about the plague of addiction, rather than considering it as a taboo or worse, something to be ashamed of. The book's message is about addiction being a chronic brain disease, coming from natural and environmental factors, and it has not to be considered as a moral failure or a lack of willpower. Compared to the movie, in the book the stages of Nick's progressive addiction, recounted by David, are flanked by memories of his own use of substances in his youth, as if the writer were almost seeking a confrontation in the attempt to explain himself, at least initially, why his son started doing drugs. Other differences include the book's raw honesty in talking about how meth harms the brain. The scene of Nick's arrest, then released on bail, is not shown in the movie. The description of the actions following this episode highlights how addiction is characterized by irrationality. Another scene reported in the movie but not mentioned in the book, despite being real, is of David taking drugs in a desperate attempt to understand how his son feels. However, although there are differences between the movie and the book, the actors who played in this story truly embodied the members of this family. The cast worked closely with David and Nick so that emotions were faithfully conveyed. In the movie, the last scene ends with Nick in hospital after an overdose. The boy, in tears, apologizes to his father for the constant betrayal of his trust, and he silently embraces him. At the end of the book, however, David recounts receiving an email from Nick's girlfriend. They are visiting the Yellowstone National Park, and in those photos, David sees his son doing well. The next day, he decided to phone him to say hello. The book ends with David delighted to finally hear the voice of old Nick, joyful and full of life. This ending, like the one in the movie, remains open. The writer wants to imply that it will be Nick who will write his own story, whether it will continue or not.